There is a very quiet rule, yet it almost always operates with precision in every relationship. Whatever is chased will naturally move away, not because it intends to leave, but because the act of chasing itself changes the position between two people. People do not respond to what you say or what you do, they respond to where you are standing when you do it. And the moment you begin to lean toward them just a little more, the balance has already started to shift, even if you don't realize it. You think you are maintaining the connection. You think that one more message, one more gesture of care, one more moment of initiative will make things more secure. But in reality, it moves in the opposite direction. You are not losing them. You are losing your own weight in the way they perceive you. And when that weight decreases long enough, distance is no longer a choice. It becomes a natural reaction. This does not begin in big moments. It starts from very small behaviors, almost insignificant. You pick up your phone and send another message, even though the last one hasn't been answered. You reread the conversation, adjusting how you appear to be more fitting. You respond immediately, not because you are free, but because you don't want them to wait. On the surface, these things look like refinement, but on a deeper level, they are signals of a shifted position. And people always sense these signals, even if they cannot name them. They do not see your effort the way you think. They feel it as a form of need. And when one person begins to need more, the other will naturally step back, not because they are cold, but because that is how psychology restores balance in distance. There are relationships that do not fall apart because of a lack of effort, but because there is too much effort in the wrong position. There are people who do not leave because they do not care, but because they no longer feel the original value that made them stay. And at some point, you begin to ask yourself, why does the more I try to hold on, the more everything slips away? That will completely change the way you operate, not by turning you into someone cold or distant, but by making you no longer pulled by any external reaction. When you no longer need to hold, you naturally become the one who sets the rhythm. When you no longer fear loss, you begin to stand in a position that cannot be replaced. In this video, you will not learn how to make others stay. You will understand why they leave and what happens when you stop chasing. And from there, you will see a very different kind of power. Not loud, not forceful, enough to change the way every relationship around you operates. Let's begin. 1. The invisible scale, where everything begins to shift. There is something that always exists in every relationship, but is rarely seen clearly. A scale. No one talks about it. No one measures it in any concrete way. But it is always there, quietly adjusting every interaction, every feeling, every reaction between two people. That scale does not measure what you say. It measures how much you need. And the problem is, it begins to tilt from very small things, not when they become distant, not when they reply less, but from the moment you begin to lean toward them just a little more, just a little, but enough to change the entire direction of the relationship. You don't notice it immediately, because on the surface, everything still seems normal. You just send one more message, you just care a little more, you just take initiative one more time, but those little things are exactly what are quietly accumulating. And the scale begins to move. Your side becomes heavier, not because you are more valuable, but because you are investing more, while their side becomes lighter, not because they care less, but because they don't have to hold as much as you do. This is where most people misunderstand. They think the one who gives more has more value, but in psychological reality, the opposite happens. The one who invests more is usually the one with less power in that relationship, not because they are weak, but because they have placed themselves in the position of having something to lose. Pause for a moment and look closely. When you are the one who always starts the conversation, you are sending a signal. When you are the one who always maintains the rhythm, you are sending a signal. When you feel the need to do something so things don't fade away, you are sending a signal. And these signals do not need words. They are felt very clearly. Human beings have a very strange ability. They don't always understand the reason, but they always sense the position. They don't need to analyze to know that you need them more. They just feel it, and then they respond to that feeling. They begin to reply more slowly, less proactively, invest less. not because they are doing it on purpose, but because the scale has changed and their behavior is simply a reflection of that shift. And this is the turning point that few people realize. You are not chasing because they are pulling away. They begin to pull away because you are chasing. What you think is a reaction is actually the cause. What you think is how you hold things together is exactly what makes everything slip faster. The scale never lies. It doesn't care how kind you are, how sincere you are, or how much effort you have made. It reflects only one thing: who needs more? And in every relationship, the one who needs less always has more options, not because they are better, but because they do not place their entire state on the outcome of that relationship. And from here, there is something you need to start doing, not with them, but with yourself. Ask yourself one question: is this worth it? Not should I be polite? Not will they think I'm rude if I don't reply? Just, is this worth my attention? If the answer is no, keep moving. No guilt, no hesitation. No explanation needed. Imagine your attention as a stream of water flowing through a garden. Where you water more will grow, where you neglect will slowly dry out. And the issue is not which garden is more beautiful, but that you are unconsciously watering places that are no longer worth it. Because when you stop watering what has no value, you preserve your energy for what truly deserves to bloom. 2. Effort in the wrong position, when value turns into need. There is a truth that most people do not want to face. Effort does not always create value. Sometimes effort itself is what exposes the lack of value. It sounds paradoxical, but if you observe long enough, you will see this pattern repeating over and over again in relationships. The more you try, the heavier everything becomes. The more you give, the less the other person responds. The more you hold on, the more they tend to let go. The problem is not that you're doing something specifically wrong. It lies in where that action is coming from. Effort, when it comes from fullness, creates attraction. But effort, when it comes from lack, creates pressure. And people always sense the difference very clearly. Look at the smallest behaviors, but the ones that make all the difference. You reply to messages immediately, not because you want to, but because you are afraid of losing the rhythm. You explain more than necessary, not to be clear, but to be understood. You try to keep the conversation going, even when it has already started to fade. These things, on the surface, look like care. But at a deeper level, they carry a different message. I don't want to lose you. And the moment that message is sent, your value begins to change, not in your own eyes, but in how they perceive you. Because in human psychology, what has high value does not need to prove itself too much. What has high value does not need to be held onto. It is chosen. But what constantly tries to be kept is unconsciously placed in a replaceable position. This is very hard to accept because you have been taught that caring is good, effort is necessary, persistence is admirable. But no one tells you that if all of those things are placed in the wrong position, they are no longer strengths. They become signals of dependence. Imagine this. Two people walk into a room. One says very little but has a clear presence. The other talks more, tries harder to connect, adjusts themselves more to fit in. Who creates more impact? Not the one who does more, but the one who does not need to do too much. Because inner stability always creates a kind of gravity. It does not pull others through action. It pulls through state. And when you begin to put in effort to keep someone, you are stepping out of that state. You move into a different role, the one who needs to be reciprocated. And from that moment, every action you take, no matter how subtle, carries an invisible layer of pressure. The other person may not say it, but they feel it. They begin to feel like they have to respond, have to maintain, have to match the level you are giving. And when a relationship starts to contain the word have to, it is no longer a choice, it becomes an obligation. And people always tend to move away from what makes them feel constrained, not because they are careless, but because they are trying to regain a sense of freedom. And this is the point you need to see very clearly. You are not losing them because you are not good enough. You are pushing them away because you are trying too hard to keep them. This difference changes everything in how you see things. It is no longer, what do I need to do more? But from what position am I doing this? When you begin to ask that question, you will realize something very clearly. Real value does not come from how much you do, it comes from whether you need to do it at all. And sometimes what makes you more valuable is not doing more, but stopping at the right moment. 3. Overpresence, when value becomes taken for granted. There is a very subtle paradox, and if you are not still enough to notice it, you will repeat it many times in your life. The more you make something always available, the less it is appreciated. Not because it loses its true value, but because the perception of value is always tied to scarcity, and that is where everything begins to change. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough to completely shift how others perceive you. Observe something very simple. When you always respond immediately, they no longer feel that waiting is part of the experience. When you are always present, they no longer feel your presence as something special. When you are always available, they no longer think of you as someone to prioritize. You are not doing anything wrong. You are just showing up too much. And that presence, repeated long enough, will shift from valuable to taken for granted. This is a very dangerous transition because it does not happen instantly. It accumulates little by little. You do not realize what you are losing until the other person begins to change. They become less proactive, less excited, less present. And you think, maybe I need to do something to pull this back. So you do more, show up more, take more initiative, care more. But you don't realize that very thing is accelerating the loss of value. Because when someone does not have to earn you, they will no longer feel that having you is something special. Imagine it this way. There are two sources of light. One is always on, unchanging, never disappearing. One turns on and off, unpredictable. Which one will attract more attention? Not the brighter one, but the one that creates contrast. People are drawn to change, to distance, to what does not fully belong to them. But what is always present gradually becomes the background, and the background is not noticed. This is not a new theory. Even Niccolò Machiavelli observed this mechanism very clearly in the courts and power councils of Renaissance Italy. He recognized that those who lasted the longest were not the ones who spoke the most, nor the ones who were always at the center. They were the ones who understood one thing deeply. There are moments when silence is the strongest statement, not because they had nothing to say, but because they did not need to speak to prove their position. And that very lack of need creates weight. Back to you. The problem is not that you need to disappear to create value. It is that you need to stop turning yourself into something always available. Stop responding just because you fear silence. Stop showing up just because you fear being forgotten. Stop maintaining the rhythm just because you fear things will fade away. Because the truth is, what truly has value does not need to be maintained by constant presence. It is maintained by perception. And that perception only exists when there is space. There is a very simple question, but powerful enough to change your behavior. If I don't do this, what would actually happen? If the answer is nothing would really change, then perhaps it was never necessary to begin with. Silence does not always make you lose your position. It reveals your true position. And when you stop filling every empty space, you begin to see who is moving toward you and who only stands still when you move closer. 4. Invisible pressure. When care turns into a burden, there is something very few people realize. Not all care is felt as warmth. Sometimes it is felt as pressure. Not obvious pressure, nothing is said, but it is there, quietly, building over time, until the other person starts to pull away and you don't understand why. You think, I'm just showing that I care. I'm just trying to maintain the connection. I didn't do anything wrong. And yes, you didn't do anything wrong. But you also don't realize the way you do it is creating something completely different from your original intention. Look a little deeper. When you constantly text, constantly check in, constantly maintain the rhythm, you are not only sending care, you are also unconsciously sending an expectation that they will respond. You may not say it, but they feel it very clearly. They begin to feel that they should reply. They should maintain the conversation. They keep the connection at the level you are keeping it. And the moment the word should appears, the relationship is no longer a natural choice. It becomes a form of obligation. And people always tend to move away from what feels like an obligation, even if it once felt comfortable. This is exactly where things begin to shift, not because they no longer like you, but because they start to feel pulled in, not in an obvious, forced way, but like a very light yet constant pull, like an invisible string. You pull a little, they step back a little. You pull more, they step back more, until the distance becomes large enough and they no longer want to return to the old position. The problem is, you don't realize you are pulling. You think you are holding. But in their perception, you are creating an energetic field that makes them feel they have to respond to keep balance. And when someone has to do something to maintain comfort in a relationship, they will begin to find ways to reduce your presence, not because they dislike you, but because they are trying to regain space for themselves. This is one of the biggest paradoxes. The more you try to make things feel closer, the more the other person needs distance to feel comfortable. And if you don't realize this, you will fall into a very familiar loop. They pull back, you move forward. You move forward, they pull back. The more it repeats, the greater the distance becomes until you feel, I did everything, but still couldn't keep it. But the truth is, you didn't lose them because you didn't do enough. You lost them because you did too much in a way that made them no longer feel free. Pause for a moment and ask yourself a very simple question. Is my presence bringing comfort or creating a sense of obligation to respond? If you are honest enough to answer, you will see one thing very clearly. Not every connection needs to be maintained through constant action. Sometimes what keeps a relationship the strongest is the ability to let it be natural, not forced, not pulled, not maintained by one-sided effort. There is a very simple principle, but if you understand it deeply, it will change the way you act. What needs to be maintained through pressure will never last long. And when you stop creating that pressure, you are not losing the relationship. You are only removing what has been quietly making it heavy from the inside. 5, you trade your inner stability to keep others' malfinas. There is a very quiet cost that most people do not realize the moment they begin chasing someone. It is not time. It is not effort. It is their own inner stability. At the beginning, everything still feels light. You just pay a little more attention. You just wait a little longer. You just care a little deeper. But then, very slowly, almost impossible to notice, your state begins to change. You check your phone more often, not because you have something to do, but because you are waiting. You pay attention to how long they take to respond, not to understand, but to measure. You think about every word, not to communicate, but to avoid being wrong. And from there, you are no longer just participating in the relationship. You begin to be controlled by it. This is a very important shift, because when your state begins to depend on how someone else shows up, you have unconsciously handed control to the outside. They reply quickly, you feel at ease. They are silent, you start to feel uneasy. They change a little, you begin to overthink. Not because you are weak, but because you have placed a part of your state in someone else's hands. And when that happens, you are no longer grounded in yourself. You begin to act not from clarity, but from reaction. They slow down, you try harder. They pull away, you move closer. They are silent, you fill the space. You think you are keeping things from slipping away, but in reality, you are pulling yourself out of the most stable position you once had, the position of someone who is not affected by external fluctuations. There is something worth reflecting on. A truly attractive person is not someone who makes others pay attention, but someone who does not lose their stability, whether others pay attention or not. They do not need to check for responses to feel enough. They do not need to be reciprocated to feel valuable. They do not need to keep anyone to feel like they are not losing. And that very state creates a different kind of gravity, not the kind that pulls, but the kind that makes others adjust themselves to align. On the other hand, when you trade your inner stability to maintain a relationship, you place yourself into a loop with no end. You will always need one more signal to feel secure, always need one more response to feel enough, always need one more action to keep your state from dropping. But the problem is, those things are never stable because they do not belong to you. They depend on someone else, and anything you cannot control will always make you unstable. This is where you need to stop, not to change the other person, but to take back control from within. Ask yourself a very direct question. Am I living from my own state or am I living in reaction to someone else? If the answer is the second, then it is not the relationship that is out of balance. It is you who has stepped away from your center. And once you return, everything begins to change, not immediately, but clearly. You no longer react as quickly as before. You no longer feel the need to fill every empty space. You are no longer pulled by every small change. You begin to slow down, but not because you care less, but because you are no longer trading yourself to keep anyone. And this is what many people do not understand. You do not lose connection when you become stable. You only lose the connections that depended on your instability to exist. What remains, what truly fits, will naturally adjust to stay, without you having to hold it. 6. Stopping is not loss, it is reversal. There is a very common misunderstanding, and also a very dangerous one, that if you stop, everything will end. That if you don't hold on, the other person will leave. That if you don't do something, the relationship will slip away. But the truth is, most of what is slipping out of your hands is not because you stop, but because before that, you tried to hold on too much. Stopping is not letting go of a relationship. Stopping is letting go of the way you have been doing it wrong. This is a very subtle shift, and if you do not look deep enough, you will completely misunderstand it. You think, I need to do something to make things better. But sometimes, the very act of constantly doing something is what prevents things from ever having the chance to rebalance themselves. Imagine a surface of water. If you keep stirring it, you will never see a clear reflection, not because the water cannot be still, but because you do not allow it the chance to be still. A relationship is the same. When you constantly text, constantly maintain the rhythm, constantly create interaction, you do not allow space to exist. And when there is no space, there is nothing for the other person to feel again, nothing for them to notice the absence, nothing for them to move toward you on their own, because you have already done everything. This is a very important point. People only truly feel the value of something when they have the space to miss it. If you are always there, there is nothing to miss. If you always fill the space, there is nothing to realize. And when there is no feeling, there is no motivation to move closer. That is why stopping is not loss. It is creating the condition for things to be seen as they truly are. When you stop, two things will happen. First, the balance begins to adjust itself. No longer pulled to one side, no longer maintained by one-sided effort. Second, the truth begins to reveal itself. Those who truly care will move closer. Those who only respond when you initiate will stay still. No need to analyze, no need to guess, just observe. And that is something you could never see before, because you were always the one maintaining the rhythm. There is something worth reflecting on. You cannot know your true position in a relationship if you are always the one pulling it forward. You only know when you let go and see how it moves on its own. This is not a game, not a strategy, but a return to the right state, a state where you are no longer trying to control the outcome. You simply hold your own clarity. You no longer text just to maintain, no longer show up just to fill, no longer react just because you are afraid of losing. You begin to do nothing. But that very doing nothing becomes the strongest thing you have ever done because it returns choice to both sides. No force, no pull, no control driven by fear. And when choice returns, what truly has foundation will stand on its own, and what only existed because of your effort will fall away on its own. Not because you lost it, but because it was never truly there to begin with. And that is when you realize something very clearly. You do not need to hold on to the right person. You only need to stop holding the wrong way. The rest will arrange itself. 7. The one who does not chase is the one who gets chosen. There is a truth that is very hard to accept, but if you look deeply enough, you will see it repeating everywhere. The one who gets chosen is rarely the one who tries to be chosen. Not because they do not care, but because they do not place themselves in a position where they must be chosen. This is a very small difference, but it creates two completely different outcomes. One person enters a relationship with the mindset, I hope I'm good enough for them to stay. Another enters with the mindset, I will see if this is right for me. The actions may look the same, but the position is completely different. And people always sense that position. No words needed, no explanations needed. The way you show up is enough. When you chase someone, you unconsciously place them in a higher position. You adjust yourself to fit. You think in ways to please. You act to maintain the connection. And all of those things, no matter how subtle, send a very clear signal. You have more value than I do in this relationship. You may not say it, but that energy is always present. And when someone is placed in a higher position, they do not need to try to keep you, not because they are bad, but because the structure of the relationship has been set that way. On the other hand, the one who does not chase is not someone cold. They simply do not run after. They do not try to fill every gap. Do not try to maintain the rhythm when things slow down. Do not try to prove themselves when it is unnecessary. They are there, but not dependent on having to be there. And that creates a kind of distance, not physical distance, but perceptual distance. Others cannot fully grasp them, cannot fully predict them, cannot fully know that they will always be there. And that uncertainty activates attention, curiosity, investment. There is a very clear paradox. People are not attracted to what is always available. They are attracted to what they could lose, not because they like loss, but because value is always tied to uncertainty. When you do not chase, you are not trying to create attraction, but you unconsciously create the conditions for it to appear, not through action, but through position. You no longer ask, what do I need to do for them to like me? You begin to ask, is this worthy of me? And when the question changes, your entire way of showing up changes with it. You no longer react as quickly as before, no longer overadjust as before, no longer fear loss as before. You become less predictable, not because you are trying to be, but because you are no longer operating from need. And that very lack of need creates a very particular kind of attraction. Not loud, not showy, but enough to make others adjust how they approach you. And here is the most important point. The one who does not chase is not always the one who gets chosen, but they are always in the position to choose. While the one who always chases, even if they are chosen, is often in an unbalanced state, because they have already traded their position from the very beginning. In the end, it is not whether you get someone or not that defines your value. It is how you maintain your position throughout the process. And sometimes what makes you most valuable is not that you keep someone, but that you no longer need to. There is something very clear after everything you have just gone through. You never truly lost anyone because you stopped chasing. You only began to lose them from the moment you lost yourself in the process of trying to keep them. That is the real nature of it. Not that they changed too quickly, not that you were not good enough, but that your position had quietly shifted very early on from very small behaviors, from the moments you leaned toward them just a little more, from the times you chose to maintain the connection instead of maintaining yourself. And when that repeats long enough, you do not just lose balance in the relationship, you lose your own center. But it is also there that another door opens. When you stop, not stopping because of hurt, not stopping to prove anything, but stopping because you begin to see clearly. You see clearly that not everything needs to be held. Not everyone needs to stay, and not every connection is worthy of your attention. You begin to return to your own rhythm, to your own state, to the stability you once unconsciously traded away. And from there, a very quiet shift happens. You no longer react the same way, no longer feel the need to fill every gap, no longer feel that you must do something to keep things from slipping away. You still connect, but you are no longer dependent on the outcome of that connection. You still care, but you no longer trade yourself to keep that care alive. And this very state creates a different kind of power, not loud, no need to prove, but enough to change the way people interact with you. In the end, what you realize is not how to make them come back, but you no longer need them to come back. Not because you have become cold, but because you have returned to your rightful position. A position where you do not need to chase to be kept, a position where you do not need to try to be chosen. And when you are there, everything becomes clear. Who is right for you will stay. Who is not will leave on their own. No force, no holding. And perhaps that is the simplest conclusion. What is truly meant for you will never require you to chase it.